Oh, yeah, there. Okay, cool. Good afternoon. I'll call to order this regularly scheduled meeting of the Community Development Committee of the Metropolitan Council. I'm the chair, Councilmember Robert Lilligren, joined by a quorum of the committee. Great, and thanks everyone for being here. We will start the agenda with the approval of the agenda. Unless there are any corrections, we'll just consider it approved. So approved. The second item is approval of the minutes of the Community Development Committee of November 7th, 2022. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. Our consent item is the City of Rosemount Comprehensive Plan Amendment. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Now on to our non-consent business item. It's item 2022-280. It's a Joint Committee's item. It's a 2022 budget amendment for the fourth quarter, and Nick Hendrikson is here to present. Welcome, Mr. Hendrikson.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Nick Hendrikson, and I'm the Finance Manager for Community Development. So I am here to present the fourth quarter operating budget amendment for Metro HRA, and the operating budget details can be found in the attachment 2. So Metro HRA has seen an increase in expenses due to portability, and portability is a requirement of the Housing Choice Voucher program that allows families to live in any location in the country that operates Housing Choice Voucher program. When a voucher holder moves outside the Metro HRA's jurisdiction to a new location, that public housing agency can either absorb that voucher into their own program or invoice Metro HRA for fees to administer that voucher. So this year, Metro HRA has seen a decrease in the number of vouchers that are absorbed by those receiving PHAs, resulting in higher portability fee payments in '22 than anticipated. So this amendment is requesting to increase Metro HRA's revenues and expense authority by $250,000. This is a net zero to the bottom line since Metro HRA receives fee revenue to administer the Housing Choice vouchers from HUD, so there is no impact to the use of reserves. So our requested action is that the Metropolitan Council authorize the 2022 unified budget as indicated and in accordance with the attached tables. So thank you and
Thank you for that report and for your questions on Mr. Hendrickson's report. Any questions? Hearing none, Mr. Hendrickson has proposed that we authorize the 2022 Unified Budget Amendment as indicated in accordance with the tables attached to the business item. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you, Councilmember. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll move on to our information items. First is presentation on community designations, and Raya Esmaeili is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Esmaeili.
Hello,
Hello.
Mr. Chair, committee members. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Wait, no, I don't need it. Sorry, I was like trying to figure out if I need a clicker or not.
I think she does, doesn't she? Or?
I don't need it. Do I?
You do. Yeah, you do.
I'm sorry. I'm confused. Got it.
Get the hang of it.
Okay. I'm Raya Esmaeili. I'm a senior planner in local planning assistance and in community development. And with Paul Hansen, we are working on the community designations project. We started earlier, well, in the beginning of this year, rather at the end of 2021. And we have been before you on, let me move past. We have been before you on January of 2022 at a CDC meeting and also presented an update to the full council in June of this year. Just talking about the project for community designation. So I'll just briefly talk about what you have in front of you. Community designation is one of the projects for the regional 2050 Regional Development Guide. There are several pieces of the regional planning process that are moving ahead community designations being one of them. Community community designations themselves are a component that help further regional policy at a local level. They kind of set that, they set the density expectation and land use policy. We use community designation to base those policies on, and they help us distinguish differences and similarities between communities in the region. They also help us direct growth in the areas that have the urban structure, and also help us protect agricultural and natural land. The project, as I mentioned, was kicked off at the end of last year with scoping, and we came before you in January to help us officially kick it off and hand it to the Land Use Advisory Committee as the recommending body that will be making the final recommendation to CDC for the next steps of this project, and which is making a recommendation on draft community designation for work in the rest of the regional planning development process. We kicked off our meeting in, as I said, oh my God, I mentioned January like a million times, with engagement with our committees, but also we formed 2 focus groups, one external focus group and one internal focus group. Our internal focus group was of council staff, and external focus group from planners around the region. The process also included analysis of the past community designations, but also what can be worked better, and feedback from the focus groups. And it was an iterative process between Land Use Advisory Committee and the focus groups, and internally working on these designations and working on different variables. So we went back and forth between engagement and analysis. And I will talk about that a little more. The timeline of the process, as I mentioned, was all of this year. Our initial hope was maybe we will be able to bring the final recommendation to CDC at the end of this year, but we knew from the beginning that that was a very aggressive timeline. So at the moment, the plan is to bring the final draft community designation to the Land Use Advisory Committee at their January meeting, and then after that in February to CDC and the Metropolitan Council. The deliverables of this project being the community designations themselves, so a shapefile and a map, as well as the criteria that defines that. And we also will kick off the evaluation of the density expectation, which will go hand in hand with community designations later on. Just for reference, this is the Thrive MSB 2040 community designations. And the 5 variables that are listed are what was used to define these designations in the last round of the regional planning. I won't go through that too much. This is the project process that I basically already covered. And as I mentioned, we are we're in Q4 of 22. And what we did most recently was that we released, or since we have been here, we released a draft of these designations for feedback to all of the communities in the metro area, and asked for what their thoughts were about the groupings. We tried to be very clear that there are no policies associated with these community designations yet. So this was just about making sure that the groupings of the communities made sense locally. So it was a kind of a ground truthing of the analysis that we had done. At the moment, and we did present this also to LUAC last week, so I think Councilmember Wolf is very familiar, can probably do this presentation on her own as well. We are working on those feedbacks that we have received from the communities and trying to incorporate them in the community designations to bring a final version to LUAC in January, so that's Q1 2023. I won't bore you too much with this, but this is just a list of the different variables that we analyzed and decided to include or exclude for a variety of reasons. The ones that are listed under the excluded column are those that, all of these variables were, I should say, were analyzed at one level or another. Some of them were analyzed further, and some were excluded earlier in the process for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons being the data not being available, the data not being complete around the region because we wanted something that covered the entire region, or the data not being descriptive for the purposes that we were hoping for, or that the data was basically reacting to or negating another piece of information that we were including, so they were just canceling each other out. So that's some of the information or some of the variables that were excluded earlier in the process, and then we included some more and created, from the ones that are included here, we created several proposals, or 3 proposals rather, and presented them, I believe in September, to LUAC. So this was after LUAC had walked through these variables as well as focus groups, and these 3 were presented. So they kind of represent a different mixture of variables, but also something to mention is that we base from our engagement process, a conclusion that we came to was to not change anything outside of the Metropolitan Urban Service area. That's why the area that you're seeing on the map is only the area within MUSA. So anything outside of MUSA will retain its boundaries with the designation that it currently has. And you'll see that I'm not saying that it will retain its designation, because that technically is something that we are still developing. We're still developing the policies that will go along with those designations, but nothing about their delineation will change. So that's why you're seeing only MUSA, and inside of MUSA, you're seeing that mostly, except for one proposal, there are 4 categories instead of 5. From these proposals, LUAC actually recommended proposal B, and that was also similar to what we had heard from our focus groups. This was so that we can move forward with our comment period that I mentioned when we released this for additional feedback externally. So this was, and I know the colors are a little different, this was in order to make sure that there is enough differences between the colors that all of them can be seen properly on different screens. And we did include the areas outside of MUSA because we still wanted to gather as much feedback, even related to potentially future policies that we can pass on to the next parts of the regional planning process. So this is what they saw, and what you're seeing on the left is basically the variables that we're going with. The first one, MUSA, being that it is limiting the area that the variables are being analyzed in. And the other 3 are age of the housing stock, which is a proxy for age of infrastructure, intersection density, and planned residential densities, which is coming from the 2040 2040 local plans. So that's one of the, that's the main variable that has changed from Thrive to this round. In Thrive, instead of residential density, it was percent of developable land. So we have switched that to this, which was more representative of communities' future plans, basically. What we heard from the external, or rather the comment period that we had just recently, we were able to get 27 responses. We had 7 specific suggestions for change for communities that thought they were not grouped properly. But we did hear that people thought that most designations were in fact accurate. And we had some comments about the fact that there are differences inside of a community itself, but we had addressed that through the process, and that, that's something that communities are flexible to address in their own local plan. and the importance of keeping the process iterative, but also appreciation that there was engagement ahead in this process, and also potentially consideration for comp planning for smaller communities, but that's something that's definitely outside of the scope of this project. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we're going back to LUAC with the finalized draft recommendation, and that will include the changes that we have received, or the comments that we have received from the communities, as well as just cleaning up the map, making sure everything lines up, and bringing that to LUAC on their January meeting. And then LUAC's recommendation will come to CDC on February 6, 2023, and then subsequently to the Metropolitan Council on February 22nd. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions or direct them to Paul.
Thank you, Ms. Esmaeili. Questions on that report? Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Since she just said everything that LUAC's been doing, can I skip my next update of what LUAC's been doing?
Well, it sounds like you're gonna need to be there in January, because you're gonna vote on this. Thank you for your service on LUAC, for sure. Okay. Anything else? Great. Yeah, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so on slide 7, if there are the 7 cities or townships that had alternative suggestions for their designation, what happens when that happens? Do we kind of negotiate with what that might be, or do we change them, or what?
Ms. Esmaeili.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, what we have been doing is that we've been going back to the data behind these designations that you're seeing on the screen to see what made that community fall within that specific group. So about the specific variables with the age of housing, intersection density, and residential density. So we are we double-checked the data that resulted in that specific group. And then we'll also check that with the specific land use analysis that we have done from their 2040 plan to see whether or not it aligns with that, to come to a conclusion of whether or not the suggestion that they're making is based on, is supported more with the data, or is something that maybe we're not capturing with the data. We are hoping to, and then I am going to check with all the sector representatives of those communities to, again, ground truth some of that information that they know better than me in some of these areas that have provided the feedback. And we are in communication with the communities themselves who have provided that information to reach out to them and potentially discuss them further, but also tell them about the data behind the analysis to see whether or not our data potentially is problematic, or it's something that maybe it's an assumption on the city side that we are not understanding. So there will be a little bit of back and forth, but also we'll make sure that we mention the fact that this is a draft of these designations, and a lot of communities had mentioned that it's very difficult for them to provide meaningful feedback without knowing the policies associated with these designations, which we completely understand. So because of that, along the process, as forecasts, for example, are known and as more policies are discussed, some of these designations could potentially change, and also through the 2050 planning process, when they do their local plan, they may still change. So we will be sure to communicate the fact that this is not set in stone by any means, and can change as some of the additional information is better known in future steps.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom.
I think Councilmember Vento, you
Go ahead.
had
Oh,
your
I
hand up.
You
apologize.
beat me
By a split second, but.
Go ahead.
Okay, just a quick question. Is there any themes in the 7 designations where they're taking issue, meaning are they coming from like third ring suburbs or first ring suburbs, or a particular data set that they are quibbling about, or maybe there's no theme at all?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Lindstrom, I can't say that I can detect a theme necessarily. I can say that a lot of the comments are not coming from the very core areas because there isn't much change, and a lot of those communities kind of expect to be grouped together. It's a lot of the, it's more on the communities on the edge that they were potentially in Thrive were grouped with different communities, and now they're just unsure about whether or not they have shifted groups. So instead of a theme being that they believe that their intersection density or saying anything about their variable, they provided comments such as, we believe we're more like this city, not this other city. So they would, for example, the city of Maple Grove in this case said that we believe we look more like Woodbury than we do of Plymouth. So that would be, those are the types of comments that we received, which we were hoping to in fact receive. So I guess they're more in the suburban areas. We didn't receive a ton of comments in the lighter blue because I think they were grouped the same way or similarly to how they were grouped in Thrive anyway. So it was more about those that may have shifted between groups.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Councilmember Vento, my apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about on the excluded list, a significant part of the East Metro area is impacted by water issues. And not just one, but multiple water issues, whether it's PFAS or shortages of water and lake levels going down and being under a court order. And I'm curious as to whether or not any of those issues surfaced in the discussions, and if so, kind of how?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, they sure did. Specifically with our external focus group, we talked a lot about the water issues. We did have planners from those communities as part of the focus group. We also presented to the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee and their Technical Advisory Committee, and water supply in general, and water supply and water issues in general were some of the topics that were brought up as concerns. We did try to include some of those variables, and they were amongst the ones that I mentioned with it either not being fully available for the entire region, or that they, in some cases, they crossed boundaries between like the cities, especially with water. They crossed the boundaries of the cities in a way that made it meaningless for the purposes of community designations to be included in that, like say a groundwater recharge area going in between half of 5 different communities, and it did not really provide anything meaningful for our discussion. We tried really hard to include anything related to water supply because that had surfaced as one of the issues that was important to a lot of our stakeholders, but we were unable to identify a database that was helpful in creating these differences and similarities between communities. So water supply and water issues in general are one of those areas that we felt were better suited to be addressed in the policies themselves as opposed to the designations or in the definitions or what helps separate these communities from each other, and rather be addressed more holistically in the policies later on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you a
Thank
lot.
you.
That, I really appreciate that.
Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on that with MOSAC and working on the water supply plan. So last time it was done, each city had a page or a chapter, and it really didn't bring things together. But this time, we're doing it in sub-regional chunks. So the area in the the Northeast that is having all of these issues, that will be a separate plan for them. And so that the issues that are most important in the subregions can be delved into more deeply on how the cities are going to work together on them.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Further questions on the report? And I apologize for messing up the speaker's queue, but I was doing some toggling between screens because I've seen this map before and I've never realized I have the sole Met Council district that only has one community designation. My entire district is urban center, and so I just wanted to verify that before I said it out loud. So I was distracted for a moment.
Are you bragging?
Kinda, yeah. Yes. Top that. Thank you. Mrs. Smythe, thanks for the work. We look forward to seeing this come forward. Again, Councilmember Wolf, thanks for your service on LUAC. Great. We will move on to our next information item. It's the Housing Choice Voucher Waitlist. I know opening updates. I know Ms. Paulson can't be here, so Terry Smith is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. Yes, I am not Stephanie Paulson. She was unable to make it, so I'm sitting in for her and presenting. This is all her work and her presentation, so just want to publicly thank her for all her hard work in navigating this complicated waiting list opening. So we're here today to just tell you a little bit about the waiting list opening that occurred in June of this year and just provide an overview, some community engagement details, some of the waiting list numbers, and some demographic information for you. So we opened in June of 2022, our waiting list. The last time we had opened was in 2019. We opened for online applications only, and this worked pretty well. It's the third time that we've done the online waiting list opening through the same software vendor and the software system. In fact, we are using the same platform that many housing authorities here in the region have used to open their waiting list. And similarly, when we opened in 2019 with both Minneapolis and St. Paul PHA, we all use the same platform, which works pretty well. But we did have accommodation options for folks that couldn't navigate the online system, so alternatives for folks. And ironically or surprisingly, we only had 6 requests for accommodations that we helped directly navigate the online system and help them do their application. We did have lots of hands-on help in the community, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. So in terms of engagement and outreach, I would say we did more engagement and outreach for this waiting list than we ever have, making sure we're reaching communities in detail and that people know that the waiting list is opening. Waiting lists are closed not only here in our region, but nationally, and so it's important to spread the word far and wide that a waiting list is opening because there aren't very many opportunities when that happens. So in preparation for the waiting list opening, Stephanie, along with the Metro HRA outreach team, did lots of outreach to the community, but they did a service provider listening session that we recorded and then subsequently delivered and sent to 300 service providers, local nonprofits, and community agencies, cultural specific organizations, providers, religious institutions, age-specific providers, county and state providers, as well as the local housing authorities and then local libraries. The Metro HRA, we sent informational flyers to all the landlords that we've worked with that have received a payment from us in the last 2 years. We sent information about how to apply to local school districts, including charter schools, public schools, special education, and ALCs. We work closely with our communications department and connected the HRA with 4 local radio stations, including Somali, Hmong, Spanish, and Native Roots Radio, as well as we put a print ad in the Sayhan Journal and had some interviews with them, and I think we had an interview with NPR as well. And then did a lot of social media blasts through Twitter and Facebook and the like. So we did far and wide outreach in the community. Perhaps most importantly, and this was a robust part of our engagement, was the waiting list was open June 22nd through the 28th of just this summer, and we did on-site community outreach. So we had 15 HRA staff members that volunteered and assisted with 213 applicants navigating that online system. So we were in the community each day of the opening, making sure people could navigate the system. We had offered interpreters for people that have English as a second language. But we were at the St. Paul Career Lab, both at Rondo, Rice, and Sunray. We were at the Minneapolis Central Library in Minneapolis, and this happened to be our busiest site where we helped 50 applicants navigate the system. We were at the Hennepin County Summer Library in Minneapolis, the Brookdale Library in Brooklyn Center, Carver County Career Center in Chaska, Ramsey County George Latimer Library in St. Paul, Al-Ilhan Islamic Center in St. Paul, the Oromo Resource Center in Fridley, African Community Services in Minneapolis, and then, of course, we had people here on site that were helping people navigate the system. So if people needed help, help was available. We have historically done random selections for waiting list placement. So as you know from previous discussions, there are way more applicants than we have slots available. And so we did a random drawing for 2,000 waiting list placements. We have an adopted policy in our administrative plan that you've all approved that requires 95% of waiting list placements be for people that either live, work, or attend school in the 7-county metro area. So not just our service area, but we expanded it to the 7-county metro area to provide opportunity for people in, for example, living in St. Paul or Minneapolis to apply to the waiting list opening. 91% of the applicants who applied to the waiting list listed a place where they live, work, or go to school in 7-county metro area. 3% that applied were from outstate Minnesota, so other areas outside the region, and then 6% of the applicants were from out of state, so out of Minnesota. Families were notified in July that they were selected or not selected for waiting list placement, and since then we've been have members of our HRA outreach team helping them navigate to get the next account set up on our online system. So they apply electronically, then they need to set up a formal account with additional information so that when their name comes to the top of the waiting list, we're able to get in touch with them. So we have outreach team members navigating and working with people to get that set up. In terms of analysis and numbers and update, as you can see in these two charts, we had less applicants this time than we did in 2019. So we had 11,098 applications received in a week. That's still a humongous number, knowing that only 2,000 are going to be placed or had been placed on the list. We asked a question this time and last time about people experiencing homelessness. It's something that we track. So this time, 23% of the applicants indicated that they were currently experiencing homelessness. Back in 2019, when we opened, we received over 17,000 applications and 28 indicated homelessness. We're not sure of the decrease in homelessness number other than we polished up our, used some examples this time and how we defined homelessness. And so maybe it was more clear to people as something that we're thinking about. Also, in terms of why we had less applicants this time than last time, it's hard to know that either. But we do know from talking to our software vendor that they have seen more waiting list openings across the country than they've ever seen since doing this work. And so waiting lists are maybe open and provide more opportunity for people to apply elsewhere. I think the other thing that may have impacted that is in 2019, we opened with St. Paul and Minneapolis PHAs, so maybe applicants that came in just automatically applied to all three lists, even if they may not want to live in our service area. In terms of who's applying during this opening, so the two bars here represent the 2022 opening and the 2019 opening, which are very similar in terms of household demographics. The majority, or 44%, are families with children, so households with children. 31% in 2022 are people living with disabilities, where the head of household is a person living with disabilities, and then 9% are represented by elderly households, and very similar in 2019. In terms of race and ethnicity of the folks that applied to the waiting list, for the 2022 and 2019 opening are shown here, and again are pretty similar. So 22% of who applied are identified themselves as white, 57% Black or African American, 3% American Indian, 3% Asian, 9% represented or self-identified as multiracial, and then 6% indicated that they were Hispanic or Latino. So current status, we have 408 families remaining on our 2019 waiting list, but that's changed. We just did a selection of 100, so it's 308 now. And so we'll go through that list before we get to the 2022 list, hopefully within the next several months. Our goal is always to reopen the list every 2 to 5 years. Closer to 2 is better. We like to have a fresh waiting list so people have their current statuses. We are able to get in touch with people, and so that we sort of accomplish that with the 2019 and the 2022 waiting list opening. I indicated on an earlier slide that people now need to sign up for the next step of the online system so that we can get in touch with them when their name comes to the top. And about 1,500 of the 2,000 have completed that process. And so now our outreach team is doing individual outreach to the folks that still haven't signed up for that system yet to make sure we can get people where they need to be. We still do also some paper mailings for people on the waiting list. So our goal is always, of course, to reach people when they're selected from the waiting list. And then I think also important to note is that if somebody comes up on the waiting list and we're unable to reach them, so they, if they don't respond, they get removed from the waiting list. But if they connect with us within 6 months, we will put them back on the list, just because it's hard to navigate when you're moving around. I just moved, so I know how many places I had to change my address. And so it can be a confusing process. So we allow that grace for families. In terms of how often we open the waiting list or how many people are selected, it's really dependent on our federal funding, how many people go off the program, how much money we get, do we get new vouchers, and so it depends on a lot of things out of our control. So we just watch the numbers carefully and do waiting list selections as we're able to do so. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you,
I have
Ms.
Stephanie on the phone in case something comes up I can answer.
Well, thank you, Ms. Paulson, for
She's-
standing
I
by.
know, she's the best.
Questions and discussion, Councilmember Bento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, National Public Radio had a story on about the rising number of homeless senior citizens in Montana. And so I was particularly interested on slide 11. Although that doesn't look like a significant increase, I'm concerned that it is, and that it may continue to grow. I remember during the
I think Councilmember
Protest.
Bento's slide 10 is what you're referring to.
10?
right?
Oh, I'm sorry,
Oh, this one.
okay.
Yes.
The protests and such following the death of George Floyd, hearing a story about a woman who lived in an area near George Floyd, an elderly woman who had to basically just keep herself as safe as she could in the housing she had at that time, and being very frightened for her life. And I remember, well, I know now yet today that I frequently think of her, particularly when I drive in that area of Minneapolis. So I'll be interested to see if we can get more information about our waiting list with the elderly and what happens to it going forward. I have a feeling that these are folks who may end up living with family and want very much to have the dignity of their own housing while they can. I have 4 younger siblings, and I would guess that they're all starting to have private conversations about who's going to take Sue. And I hope none of them have raised their hands yet, but it's an issue that I think we all need to be concerned about, and it's getting harder and harder, particularly with the escalating cost of housing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments.
Mr. Chair and
Yeah, Ms.
Councilmember
Smith.
Bento, just to provide a little more context, I do have when we opened our waiting list in 2015, I have those numbers too, and so it was 9% elderly in 2015, and then it dropped to 7% in 2019, and then back up again in 2022
Okay.
to 9%.
Okay,
It's hard to know why, but
yeah,
just for context.
interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for the additional context. Further discussion, Councilmember Muse and then Lindstrom.
Just I just want to express my deep appreciation to your deep multicultural outreach by really reaching out to different communities, using different, media outlets. So kudos to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Agree. Thank you, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Well, thanks, and you may have mentioned this, but what was the reason that we didn't combine forces with St. Paul and Minneapolis this time around?
Ms. Smith?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Lindstrom, they just weren't ready to open their lists yet. When we opened in 2019, Minneapolis put 3,500 on their list, and we only did 2,000. St. Paul did 2,000, but now St. Paul's opening, I think in October. So they announced their waiting list opening, but they weren't quite ready to say go when we were ready.
Very good, thanks.
Thanks. Further discussion? I just want to add my thanks to Councilmember Mousse's about the robust outreach, and I think that's just really encouraging. And, numbers are numbers, and they don't lie, but the work that we're doing to improve our outreach and engage our communities, I think it's just really impressive. So if Stephanie can't hear me on the phone, thanks, Ms. Paulson, thanks to the whole team for doing that. And I'm glad you shared that figure that I think it was 6 households that sought accommodation for being unable to access the portal. I think that's amazing. I thought when we're looking at numbers like this, it would be much, much higher. So I just think that tells us something. So thanks to you, thanks Stephanie and your team for the work here and for the update. Cool. We will move on to our final information item for the evening. It is 2021 Regional Park System Visitors Study. And Darcie Vandegrift is here. Hey, Darcie, to present. Welcome, Ms. Vandegrift.
Thank you, Chair, Council members. It's my delight to be here with you this evening to share just some of the results from the 2021 visitor study. And just to give you a preview, I'm going to walk through a kind of overview and a background of the visitor survey. I'm going to share with you one of the things I'm most proud of about the study, which is that it was really a collaborative process. We had a series of data workshops with the park implementing agencies for them to provide context and interpretation and messaging around what the data mean, and so I want to share that process with you. And then I'm going to dive into 3 areas of the findings: visitor satisfaction and popular activities, some demographics of park and trail visitation, and then new visitors and information seeking. So, yeah, I jumped the gun. There's what I'm talking about. But I do want to share with you that I don't get nervous at all before these presentations. I do want to share with you that we did, the way that we engaged with our implementing agency colleagues is that we had 5 scheduled lunch conversations over the course of the summer. So we really got to spend some substantial time diving into some of these findings. And it's really important because they are the experts on their systems, and they were able to provide implications about operations and management, and implications for us in thinking about what we do at the council. So, yeah, so let's go first to the background and the implementing agency workshops. So the visitor study is done about every 5 years. It was delayed by 1 year because of the pandemic, so it was done in 2021. And it's done to help inform planning, policy, and management. We also use the findings, and the implementing agencies use the findings to evaluate and strengthen equitable use of parks and trails in accordance with the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan. And then we ask some questions to come up with some, what we call multipliers, numbers that we feed into our funding formulas to determine where funding goes for parks and trails. I'm not diving into that too much in the presentation tonight, but I'm happy to share more if you're interested. So the surveys were done in summer of 2021, and they were administered in the field by Wilder Research, and I can say nothing but complimentary things about them, about the kind of the high quality and rigor that they brought to the process in terms of recruiting a staff that looks like the region's residents, and the training that they did of those staff. So I'm very confident in the quality of the data because of the excellent work that they did. We did over 5,400 surveys with an over 50% response rate. If you've worked with surveys before, you know that that is a very good response rate. And we then weighted the data. Initially in the sample, we did quotas that were proportionate to visitation. So our higher, we tried as much as possible possible higher visited parks and trails had more surveys. There was at least 393 surveys per implementing agency. And then we wanted to be able to, and this is something that implementing agencies always want more of, we wanted to be able to provide some unit level data. In other words, some data at one park or one trail where we could really know with an acceptable margin of error some information about that. So we had one oversampled park or trail for each implementing agency. We got the data back from Wilder Research, and we reviewed it and analyzed it in-house. And the report is in communications right now, being copy edited. And so we are going to publish that. My hope is by the end of the year. So then to just summarize, we had the data collection in summer of 2021 and preparation of that data to turn it over to us. We got it in late 2021. We worked first with those funding inputs that I told you about and did some, and really worked with implementing agencies so everyone understood and felt confident in those results. Then we had the summer data workshops. We also went to MPOSC, as Councilmember Vento can tell you, 3 times to talk about the data in depth with them. And then we're working now on publication of the findings, and I'm also presenting to Parks and Open Spaces commissions across the region on invitation. Okay, so let's look first at visitor satisfaction and popular activities. So first we can, so we asked the question about just how satisfied were you with the facilities that you visited that day, and we reported 88% reported that the facilities were very good or excellent. We found some patterns here. There were higher levels of satisfaction in newer facilities, which wouldn't surprise you, and in older facilities there was a slightly lower rate of satisfaction. And then we asked, what is one improvement that you would suggest that would have to make your visit better today? And the tops, looking at the Tops Park suggestion was that there was just general satisfaction, that everything was good. But for trails, we saw a request for better trail maintenance. And there were comments that were important around the need for accessible, good, high-quality restrooms, get rid of the porta potties, access to water, improve signage, and also shade. You remember in 2021, we were having really hot weather, and we think that contributed to that there. It's also interesting to look at popular activities by different social demographics. Now, in the report, you can see sort of overall, in-depth, all of the popular activities by parks and trails. But one thing I wanted to share with you is what are the top 3 activities for different social characteristics. So the most popular activity with everyone was hiking and walking. But then the second most popular activity, we see a little bit of difference for among age 12 to 44 years old, so that's several age categories in there, and among Black, Latino, Asian American, and multiple race identified visitors, as well as gender non-binary visitors. The second most popular activity was relaxing and doing nothing. And the second, for among age 45 plus, American Indian, white visitors, and men. Biking was the second most popular activity. Among women, dog walking and visiting the dog park was second most popular. And among groups that included members with a disability, observing nature was the second most popular. And then for the third most popular activities, for women, gender non-binary, ages 12 to 24, Black, Latino, and multiple race visitors, biking was most popular. So you see there's some overlap there. Age 44 to 64 and white visitors, dog walk and dog park. I always have to say I resemble that accusation, with the dog walking being popular. Family, and then for American Indian, Asian American visitors, family and friend meetups were the third most popular. For age 65 plus and men, observing nature. And then groups including member with a disability, that number 3 was relaxing and doing nothing. And I think it's worth kind of diving into this to both understand those general trends, that there are activities that everyone loves to do in parks and trails, but also as we're thinking about what kind of programming and investments creates an equitable system, understanding that there are differences by social characteristics. So under kind of keeping those 2 things in balance, or in mind at the same time. Okay, so let's turn to looking at visitor demographics. So there's lots of demographic information presented in the visitor study, and I am not going to keep you here all evening presenting all of it. I'm really going to focus on just a few things. I'm going to look at here race and ethnicity. I'm going to look at age. I'm going to look at the intersection of race and ethnicity and age, because it's quite intriguing to me and I think important to discuss. And then I'm going to look at gender as a final one. So what you will see on all of these slides is that you have a gray bar that represents the proportion of the social group in the population at large using 2020 census data. So here you have Asian Americans are 8.2% of our regional population. Black and African American residents are 10.3%. Latino residents are 7.2%, and white residents are 68.8% of the regional population. So then you have a green bar and a blue bar. The green bar is showing you the percent of park visitors that have this social characteristic, and the blue bar is looking at trail. So what you can see then, for example, Asian Americans are 4.1% of park visitors and 2.3% of trail visitors. Black and African Americans are 3.8% of park and 1.7% of trail. Latinos are 3.6% and 2.4% respectively for parks and trails. And then white visitors are a little over 84% and 91% of park and trail visitors respectively. So you can see that overall there is a disparity between the proportion of several groups of color in the region and their visitation at regional parks and trails. We see that there are differences between the regional population and park and trail visitors in terms of age as well, and I wanted to share some of that with you. So you see in the region, 19% of residents are aged 12 to 24, about 34% are aged 25 to 44. I don't have that number written down. I should, but I'm going to say it's about 30% are aged 45 to 64, and then 17% are 65 and older. And again, you see that there are generally disparities in park and trail visitation for young people. Young people visit in are represented among visitation about half of their proportion of the regional population. And you see that gap extends to age 25 and 44 just for trails. So we could say that that young people are, we could use the term underserved, or that there is a disparity for young people's visitation at trails up to age 44 and at parks for age 12 to 24. Whereas again, I resemble that accusation. I'm in that 45 to 64 age group. That age group is visits parks and trails greater than their proportion of the population. So here's the thing that I found interesting that I wanted to share with you, that as you see, we did a cross-tabulation looking at age and race. And here I did not disaggregate because of margin of error for all racial and ethnic groups. I did divide the sample into white and then Black, Indigenous, people of color. But what you're seeing here is that green, the proportion of the bar that is green is showing you the proportion of BIPOC visitors, and the proportion that is blue is showing you the proportion of white visitors. And as you can see here, a much larger proportion of young people aged 12 to 24 are people of color when you compare with older age groups. And it's really up to the council, policymakers, to staff, to implementing agencies to talk about the implications of this. But when we're thinking about investments in building a more equitable park system, talking about that younger age cohort seems to be extremely important to keep in mind. Okay, so the last one I wanted to share with you is gender gap. And so what you see here, again, gray bar is the proportion of men and women in the region. It's 49-51. If you want to just, it's about 50-50. And for parks, the visitation for men and women is within the margin of error. You have about parity. But when you look at trails, you see that men are 57% of visitors and women are 43% of visitors, that there is a disparity between women's proportion in the population and the proportion of trail visitors. Again, it's up to policymakers, to staff, or implementing agencies to talk about what those implications are, but again, that's an interesting, notable finding. Before I move on to some additional information, are there any comments or questions that people, because I know I'm presenting a lot of things here, to talk about either demographics or activities and satisfaction?
Great, thanks for the pause. Comments or I'll start with a question, and this was just on the last slide around age that you were showing us. And when we saw the slide before about visits, seemed to be one of the biggest disparities between visitors and usage reflecting the actual population. And so in my mind, that went right to my guess is the 18 to 24-year-olds is a more diverse population group, right? That's more people of color. So then you go into the next slide, and that's sort of reflected there, but I'm just wondering if we saw, well, I guess I'm not really phrasing my question very well, but it seems like if we saw this against the sort of like the gray line of the actual population, would that disparity still exist? Yeah, so it is existing, right? Is that what I'm seeing here?
So first of all.
That is just a more diverse
Chair-
group.
Yeah, so first of all, Chair, I think that when we're looking at this data and discussing it, it's great to not feel like we have everything, like we know exactly what we're going to say, because
Sure.
it is, there's lots here to discuss. But I think what you're saying is absolutely correct, that we do see a disparity based on age, and we also saw racial disparities in visitation too. And as you noted, the younger the population is in the region, the more racially and ethnically diverse it is. And so we may see partly that intersection there. And we're also seeing a question, if we're talking about issues like raising awareness, providing the right activities, where to make our investments, looking at young people is also looking at a more racially, ethnically diverse group. Yeah.
Thank you. And can I ask, Darcie, do you go by doctor, Dr. Vandegrift, or is
You know, whatever,
it? Okay.
yeah,
All right.
Darcie is fine, yeah.
All right, thanks, Darcie. All right. Any further questions or comments? Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems like it would be helpful at some point to do a broader survey of just people in all kinds of parks, you know, because we're only looking at one segment of the park world with this. I would suspect that some of the lower visitation in the 12 to 24 is people who are at baseball fields or soccer fields, or they're playing basketball, or, you know, other things that aren't in the regional park system, that they're getting their park needs met in another way. Because I know when my kids were that age, I was sitting at kids' sports every night of the week sometimes. So getting a better idea of what is the overall need, not just regional parks, but are people getting between the city parks and the regional parks and whatnot, getting their needs met overall for outdoor recreation would be helpful. But we don't really have a mechanism to do that.
Thank you, thanks. Further discussion, okay, I'll go Councilmember Muse, Councilmember Lindstrom, then Councilmember
Mr. Chair,
Raya.
and how often we utilize social media reaching out to the younger folks, because they are mainly really very active in those platforms?
So, Chair, Councilmember, you're asking, if I understand the question, is how often do we reach out on social media?
How often we use social media as a way to outreach to the younger group that we're struggling with?
I actually will, that is something that another part of the Parks team does, and I wonder if Emmett would like to talk about that.
Mr. Mullen, thanks for being here, welcome.
Good afternoon, council members. My name's Emmett Mullen, I'm the Parks Manager. Councilmember Muse, that's a great question. And what we are finding is that park agencies are getting into social media. They're doing a lot more. To do it well, they need to really invest in it, and some of them don't have that funding level yet. Of course, Three Rivers Park District is doing actually a really good job on social media. And I know the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, too, is getting into social media. So we've entered it, and there's a lot more work to be done.
Thank you.
That helps.
Thank you. And Councilmember Muse, let's return to that when we talk about information seeking, because I think we have a little bit more data that we can share with you on that.
Sure.
Thank you. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Oh, thanks. So sticking along the theme that Councilmember Wolf brought up about the comparing the visitors to city parks, I was thinking about the other direction, about state parks. And I suspect the state, first of all, I suspect that they do a visitor study themselves, you would know. And I suspect it looks fairly similar to our regional parks, although I don't know that for sure. And maybe you do.
So,
Darcie.
Chair, council member, so I am familiar with their previous visitor study, and the patterns, while not exactly the same, were very similar. And they are working on another one now, and I'll definitely be monitoring that. I am proud to say that we did survey 12 to 18-year-olds because we really wanted to capture that youth perspective, and I'm not sure if that will be reflected in the state parks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Councilmember Vento.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to just piggyback on Councilmember Wolf's remarks and say that I think the same is true for the age 65 plus. I live in a portion of southeast Ramsey County. There are a handful of community parks nearby, and then there's also Battle Creek Park nearby. And I see folks my age and older in some of those smaller parks sometimes more often than I do in the regional park. And part of it's proximity, part of it's the options that they provide as opposed to the regional park. So I think the question is a really good one, and it's one that we've talked about at MPOSC as being a factor, that it's hard to look just at the regional parks sometimes because we're concerned about meeting needs, and it's very possible that needs are being met, but they're being met by other park providers.
Thank you. Thanks for that perspective. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to follow up on Councilmember Lindstrom's discussion about the state park system. The regional park system actually has something like at least 4 times as many visitors as the state park system, which I thought was pretty enlightening. But one of the challenges that the state park system has more so than the regional park system, because the regional facilities are generally newer, is many of the state parks were built before ADA regulations were in place. So there's a big accessibility problem at the state park system that they're working on.
Thank you for that perspective. Further discussion? Oh, Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, I just want to note that last Thursday and again today, I had an opportunity, thanks to Emmett and Lisa, to participate in meetings with the regional park agencies. Last Thursday, it was with Commissioners Stroman, and then today it was with the park agency directors and legislative staff. And I will tell you that the agencies are so impressive, but I could go to the moon and back on the energy I get from our staff and the remarkable job that each of the staff does in terms of supporting the agencies. It's just incredible, and to sit and listen to them respond to questions and provide information and have all these facts like it's nobody's business, and it's just, it's mind-boggling. I mean, I have to stop and think about my telephone number, you know. So Darcie and Emmett and Lisa and all of your colleagues, I just can't thank you enough. You're incredible, and I can tell that you're very valued by those agencies, and so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. No further comments? Please, Darcie.
Thanks. I just have kind of 2 main topics left of this on visitors and new visitors and information, and then sharing back with you, kind of piggybacking on what Councilmember Vento said, sort of comments from implementing agency colleagues of what they see as key messages here. So this is a pretty busy slide. I apologize for that, but I do think, so we asked a question, have you visited this park or trail in the last 12 months? And to me, the people who answered no are an incredibly important That's all, folks.
If you can hear me, we lost our video.
We still have it in front of us.
We have it in front of us.
Okay, I can do that too.
We're following along.
They're an incredibly important demographic because they give us a window into the non-visitor, the infrequent, the person who might be less aware of the park system. And so I did spend some time looking into this. And so on the slide, there's a lot of information here. Oh, thank you, Councilmember Lee. So this is really looking at a lot about new visitors. And I care a lot about new visitors and information seeking because these are the folks who might not know as much about the system, that we want to be invitational with them. So, and
It's exactly
indeed,
what Jacques Vaughn
new
needs right
visitors
now.
are
'Cause if you're a new-
84% of people who said that they sought information before coming for their visit. And the things that they most wanted to know was, not surprisingly, park hours, how to park your car, and rules. And they were also this I think is important, 3 times more present, so there was a 3 times greater proportion of new and infrequent visitors at parks than at trails. So we're really seeing that, information seekers new visitors have certain kinds of information they seek, and they're more likely to be going to visit a park. So you can see here in this figure that we have this, what I've done is break it down by park versus trail visitation, and then you have first-time and return visitors at both of these. And you just see, so the blue bar are the blue part of the bar are the people that sought information, and the green part are people that didn't seek information. And not surprisingly, if you're a return visitor, that green bar is quite wide, the blue is quite small, and that's not surprising. They've already visited, they don't need more information often. But that park and trail visitors are often, for the first-time visitors, are looking for more information. So that is one thing to keep in mind and thinking about who is our audience and what are they wanting to find out in terms of visitation. So then you look at the next slide, we also see something else interesting about new visitors is that new visitors are much more likely to be people of color. You have here, for all 10 of the implementing agencies disaggregated, you have in red the proportion of return visitors that are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And in green, you have those people who had not been in the last 12 months that were Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And you see that the proportion of return visitors are just eyeballing it at between 8 and 22% people of color, but they're 12 to 35% people of color, those who are people who are new visitors. And so again, when we're thinking about outreach, we're building awareness, who are our information seekers, that larger proportion of people of color and new visitors is important to keep in mind. And I do want to share, there's a quote from one of our implementing agency colleagues in that blue box with the light bulb next to it. And this, I think, Councilmember Muse, goes back to your comment, is that there's a misperception that we only need to build the system and invest in growing the system, but good communication is what attracts people, and we need to push this priority. And the council can support this through grant opportunities, and directors, implementing agency directors, can support this through reviewing the data. That staff really wanted to emphasize how important communications is in building a more equitable park system and also just informing new users of what the system has to offer. So then we go to the last part where I'm just going to show you one slide of reviewing implementing agency insights. And so what you have here is the blue boxes at the top are really repeating some of the findings that I've already shared with you and summing it up. And then below, we have analysis from implementing agency colleagues at the summer workshop analysis. So when we spent time talking about that 88% of visitors reported that facilities were very good or excellent, and those different patterns in the suburbs and older facilities, the ideas that implementing agency colleagues wanted to share is that we can zoom in on what to do better, but it's notable that people are generally happy and positive. They also said these are key messages that the public values well-maintained and high-quality facilities, and this needs funding. You need adequate funding in order to keep our renowned park system offering the facilities that the public wants, and that trail maintenance concerns are important, and that was something that they wanted to lift up and message. And similarly, when we looked at the data on what did the public want in terms of desired improvements, they said, this is the key message, that resources are the biggest thing. The operations funding is chronically underfunded. Statute says that we could add up to 40%, and the legislature only adds up 8 to 9%. Knowing about maintenance problems informs the conversation about sustainable funding. And then finally, if you remember back to our data on equitable use and race, age, and gender differences between population and visitation, and also popular activities, that all social groups had hiking and walking as the top activity, but family events, family friend meetups, playing sports, and fishing were more popular among underserved racial and ethnic groups. Key messages that the implementing agencies put forward is that we need to continue and expand efforts to understand and meet diverse users' needs. An interesting policy piece for our parks policy plan is that open and flexible spaces are key to offering equitable opportunities. If you think about sports, you think about observing nature, or just hanging out, that those flexible spaces really make a lot of that possible. And then finally, support spaces for, quote, doing nothing, and also think about how do we scaffold or build, if hiking and walking are so popular, how do we introduce additional opportunities for somebody who comes to walk or in one space, how can they build that? We don't often think about building the skill of walking or hiking or building that interest, and how might we start to think about that? So with that, I thank you for your careful attention, and I invite any other comments or feedback or questions. And Councilmember Lee, thank you for this.
Tracy, thanks so much for this presentation, for the work. This is a lot of data. I know it's underpinned by a lot more. So it's really well presented, and yeah, it kind of makes you think. For more discussion on the second half of the report. Councilmember Mousse.
Quick question. I was just wondering, still I'm thinking about how can we engage the younger, more diverse group in our community. Have you explored partnering with local community colleges or schools to really encourage folks to come and visit, and maybe giving them a discount and some incentives to explore these beautiful amenities?
Yeah, Chair, Councilmember Musa. So I think that's a fantastic idea. I will sort of reference the Youth and Parks research, where we did look in depth about strategies for partnering with organizations and schools. I think your observations is an important one, and that relationships with schools, everything from K through 12 and university, did atrophy under the pandemic, because of course you couldn't organize events to take young people of any age out. And so that is something that I know our implementing agency colleagues are working on, of continuing and also rebuilding those relationships, as well as partnerships with other organizations that are youth serving. It's really important that, because young people need institutions often to get access to the outdoors, whether it's a school or a club or a sports team. So, yeah.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Related to that point, it would be interesting to get a report back on the equity grants that we gave out a few years ago, and maybe we have and I missed it, but now that those programs have been implemented, it'd be great to hear back if they're working or not, or what they did with the money.
Thank you. And we have heard some on it. Did you want to say something, Emmett? Or, I mean, if I remember correctly, the message came through that we just heard as well today, at the investment in programming and non-capital investment, I think was a priority. Mr. Mullen.
Council members, I'll just say that's a great idea. We are happy to come back to share those results. We did talk briefly, as you recalled, about this when we were thinking about when we should host our next round of funding. Mm-hmm. One of the issues is we just don't have that much funding right now, and if we wait a year, we'll have more. But the other piece was that implementation of equity grants is challenging, and it's taking a little slower than we envisioned, but we are starting to get some really, I've heard some really great results of some of the equity grants and outreach work, so that we would love to come and talk with you about. So I'll talk to the managers of that program, and we will be back.
Thank you. Thank you. For the discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up on Councilmember Mousse's comments. And our regional park agencies have done, other than COVID, an excellent job at reaching out to kids and getting them into the regional parks. It's actually a pretty good way to reach families, because you take the kids on a field trip, and then the kids go tell their parents, hey, this was really fun, we should go. and it gets the whole family into the parks. I was at what's informally known as Chutes and Ladders in Bush Lake Highland Regional Park, and made the mistake of going there when there was a whole bunch of school buses, and it was a little chaotic, but they are getting the kids into the parks.
Thank you. Councilmember Mento.
Recently, on a social media site, I saw some communication about where people could hold their holiday celebrations. And several folks responded with just high praise for regional park facilities in the East Metro area, one of them being Lake Elmo. And as I was reading it, I thought, I think I'd want to go to, and Lake Elmo was one of them, but I had several others, including the Ravine Park down in Cottage Grove and the Spring Lake Park Preserve down along the Mississippi. But families have opportunities there where the kids can take their parents back to the park and introduce them at a family function, and then everybody can kind of see what's going on in those parks. So whether it's a holiday celebration or a high school graduation or a baby shower or a wedding, those facilities are a great spot for family events as well, and an introduction to the park.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's also a source of a little income.
And just looking at this younger demographic, the youth demographic, and acknowledging that it's more racially and ethnically diverse, and then representing an all-urban center district, as I do, that has limited regional park access. And I just wonder, I feel like we're missing something there, and I guess maybe that's not our responsibility, you know. It's the local implementing agencies, of course, but I suspect that the numbers would look even something, I don't know what they'd look like. They would look probably different if we were capturing some of the more local parks. And so I'm just putting that out there. That's not, I don't think, you know, I'm not challenging your methodology or even suggesting something else, but I'm just making an observation.
And Chair, may
Please,
I just
Christine.
offer a couple of observations from the visitor study and the workshop this summer? I mean, what you said about young people in your district living farther from some parks, I think that connects with the findings about visitors, lower levels of visitor satisfaction in older systems with older facilities, and the implementing agencies really saying we need it may not seem like it, but bathrooms and water fountains and updated playgrounds are an equity issue, and I think your comment
Thank you.
points to
Thanks
that.
for that validation. Councilmember Wolf.
Mr. Chair, actually, the Chain of Lakes is one of the most heavily visited regional parks in the system,
But we're
as
seeing
well
who's
as
visiting.
Minnehaha. They get a ton of visitors, maybe not as much directed towards little kid things,
right.
but they are very well visited. And we actually, years back, we did a mapping of what sort of access people had to regional parks, and the core actually has better access. There's bigger ones out in the burbs, but there aren't as many people close to those as there are in
Thank you. Thanks.
Minneapolis and St. Paul.
And to go totally parochial, back to my city council days, I used to say, I don't know why we're called the City of Lakes. I don't got no lakes in my ward. So your point of distance, I think, is a good one. So, right, so thanks. Any further discussion on this report? Hearing none, thanks for this. Very excellent, very good conversation. Thank you. And we've reached the end of our agenda. Michelle, do you have anything for us? No, I don't. Lisa, nothing? All right. Seeing no further business before us, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Boom.